Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel chapters 21 through 24. This is a section where we have the stories of various stories of David. They're not necessarily in chronological order, but they all fit within the time of his reign. But there is a topical order to these. We begin chapter 21 with David's intercessory prayer in the midst of a famine. In his prayer, it turns out that he finds out that the issue is that there's an unresolved issue with the city of Gibeon. Now, that's not Gibeah, it's Gibeon, but having to do with Saul and now his descendants. So that story plays out there. Next, there's the accomplishments listed of David's, what I'm calling giant killers. So you find out, especially in the last verse there, that there's a whole family of giants, of which um, now you see the name Goliath there, but that's probably not the Goliath that David killed. Probably the father of them all is the Goliath that David killed, and then he has sons that are also big and tall. Next, we have David's Song of Praise, chapter 22. That's almost word for word right out of Psalm 18. So if you've read Psalm 18 and you go to chapter 22 here, David's Song of Praise, it's going to be pretty close to being the same thing. Next, there are David's words of praise, the first part of chapter 23, the accomplishments of David's mighty men, and there's some pretty neat stories there. So if you like, if you like action, go there and especially that battle that takes place in and around Bethlehem. That's just a neat story. But what I want to look at today is chapter 24. Again, we're going to see David's intercessory prayer this time in the midst of a plague instead of a famine. So let's go there to chapter 24. We start off. Now, again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. And by the again, it sounds like, okay, it had happened before, but we're back there again. And it incited David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. David's going to hold a census. What's wrong with the census? Well, I'm not sure of all the possibilities, but one of the things is that God had promised that his people would be innumerable. Remember, as the sands of the sea, so will your seed be, God had said to Abraham. And and David wants to count them. They're not supposed to be able to be counted, but David wants to count them. Well, and he's going to do that. So the king said to Joab, the commander of the army who was with him, remember Joab, I think oftentimes tend to be for Joab, but he has been loyal to David. And so he says to Joab, go about now through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba. Remember, Dan is as far north as you can go and still be in Israel. Beersheba is as far south as you go and still be within the confines of Israel. And register the people that I may know the number of the people. Well, Joab said to the king, now may the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are. Again, that sounds a little bit like a reference to the promises to Abraham of an innumerable people, while the eyes of my Lord the king still see. But why does my Lord the king delight in this thing? It sounds like Joab is trying to dissuade him. Sometimes Joab has some good sense. I don't know if it's always God's sense, but sometimes it is. And this seems to be the case here. So we had that opening verse that talked about the Lord's anger starting all of this, and then David's command to a census, and Joab tries to dissuade, but David says, no, I want it, and so Joab goes along with it, and he conducts a census. Next, we get to verse 10, and David repents. He realizes, I shouldn't have been doing this, and he repents to the Lord, and Gad, a prophet, comes and talks to David and says that David can choose between one of three punishments from God. So he can have 7 years of famine. That's a lot of years. He can flee for 3 months before his enemies, or he can have 3 days of pestilence coming from the hand of the Lord. And David says, whatever I get, I want it from the hand of the Lord. So he's going to choose the shorter, I don't know if it's lesser, but the shorter, 7 years, 3 months, and then 3 days, the shorter of the three judgments, the 3 days of pestilence. And we read that the hand of the Lord came and began this. So remember, this started with God, and now in the pivotal point, it's all God is bringing it, and the pestilence is on the people. And apparently, the way it's described, they could actually see it both coming and when it arrived, and it doesn't seem to be like, you have some diseases that have you're contagious and you catch it, and then maybe a week later you get sick, and this seems to be really quick. Can I say supernaturally quick, where they can actually see it coming? There it comes. It's a little closer. It's a little closer, and the pestilence is on the people. And David stands up in verses 16 and 17, and he goes out and he says, "Lord, take me instead." It reminds me a lot of the greater son of David, who will go to a cross in Jerusalem, and this takes place in Jerusalem, who will go to the cross in Jerusalem, and who will say, as if to say, "Lord, take me instead," because that's what the cross is all about. It's how he died, the penalty that you and I deserved, so that we can receive his life, the life that he deserved. Um, and David does that. It's a delightful picture of the cross. And the place where he does that is just north of Jerusalem. There's a threshing floor there that will eventually be the site of the temple, but that hasn't been built yet at this point. And so Aruna, who happens to own that plot of land, it's a threshing floor. When we say threshing floor, that's a big wide open space where you'll take grain after you've cut your grain, you bind it into rolls and you take it up to a threshing floor. Got to be a bit of wind there. You grind it and then you throw it up into the air, and this mixture of grain and the husk on which you ground it all free, it's all mixed up now. The husk is very light. That blows away, and the grain's heavier, so it falls right back down, and it's a great way to get the grain minus the husk. Aruna says, because this is where both David offered himself, it's where the plague stopped, and David resolves to offer now a sacrifice, because God says, "No, I'm not going to kill you. I could, but I'm not." And so David's going to offer a sacrifice there, and Aruna says, "Well, here, you can have the threshing floor to build your altar and do whatever you want." And David says, "No, I'm not going to sacrifice something to the Lord that doesn't cost me." So he offers to, and he does, he purchases the threshing floor. It will now become part of David's property, part of the king's property, and eventually, as we said, it's going to be the site where the temple will be built. The chapter ends up where David does offer the sacrifice, and we read that the Lord was moved. And that ends not just this chapter, but the entire book on this note of God's forgiveness in the light of a plague in this case, in the light of sinful actions. And of course, we've already seen a number of other sinful actions on David's part that brought all sorts of problems. But the book now ends on a positive note. David's still alive. When we come to First Kings next time, David will still be alive. By that time, he will be an old man. But we'll see that next time.